I still remember the exact moment the whispers began. It was around 3 weeks ago, 2:37 a.m., to be precise. Although it feels like a lifetime has passed in my heart since then. I was lying in bed, staring at the shadows that my digital alarm clock cast across the bedroom ceiling. James, my husband, was beside me, breathing softly in the heavy silence of our Manhattan apartment. I had always thought of the city as impossibly loud, even in the dead of night. But at that moment, the ambient hush of distant sirens, humming generators, and the occasional honk of a taxi seemed to fade. All I could hear was the roar inside my own head. "You're failing them!" the voice hissed, threading itself through my thoughts like a snake. "Your children deserve better. Your husband deserves better." Strangely, that voice in my head sounded a lot like Margaret, my mother-in-law, who had moved in with us a few months prior. Sometimes I wonder if deep down, my psyche had stored all her sharp criticisms over the years and decided to unleash them on me in this new insidious way. Regardless, the impact felt tangible, as though I was being physically pummeled by my own doubts. I turned to look at James, his dark hair ruffled against the pillow, his lips parted in slow, steady breaths. His presence used to calm me, used to give me the courage to face another day, another onslaught of responsibilities. But recently, even with him so close, I felt this desperate loneliness. It's as though the bond we shared is fraying, thread by thread with each passing day. I wanted to reach out and shake him awake, to tell him about the voice, about my fears, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Exhaustion slid over me like a wave, and I closed my eyes, tears slipping onto my pillow. In that instant, I remembered the faint scar on my wrist. A tiny blemish now, but a relic from my teenage years. Back then, I felt as if the silence of my life was suffocating me. Now, ironically, it's the loudness of everything that makes me feel like I'm drowning. By morning, I was exhausted, but forced myself to emerge from the covers to get the kids ready for school. Sophie, my 9-year-old daughter, had a math test that day, and I had promised her I'd help her review. But the night had left me too drained to function properly. Liam, our 6-year-old, was easier in some ways. He just needed his breakfast, a change of clothes, and plenty of encouragement to brush his teeth without skipping steps. My routine with them is typically a blur of cereal bowls, mismatched socks, last-minute homework checks, and a frantic hustle out the door. Somehow we manage. I tell myself that someday I'll miss the chaos, but in the moment, it's hard to imagine anything beyond feeling perpetually tired. Margaret was already in the kitchen when I stumbled in, trying to blink the sleep from my eyes. She's an imposing figure, tall and upright, with a stare that could slice glass. That morning she sat at the table with a cup of tea cradled in her hands, studying me as though I were a specimen under a microscope. I could sense her disapproval even before she spoke. "You let the kids eat frozen pizza again last night?" she said, her voice dripping with admonishment. "No wonder Sophie's grades are slipping. You put your career first, Anna, and the children suffer." For a moment, I said nothing. Her words had grown repetitive in recent weeks. and each time they lodged themselves in my mind like daggers. My stomach churned with anxiety and anger. I wanted to defend myself, tell her that I love my children more than any job, that my work as an account manager provides for them, that I'm doing the best I can. But I also knew that Margaret was set in her perceptions. Trying to argue felt futile, so I pressed my lips together, forcing a polite smile. "I'll make sure to cook something healthier tonight," I said. My tone clipped. My heart pounded, and I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. I longed to say more, to tell her how hurtful it was to be constantly judged, but I couldn't bring myself to fight. I left for work with a heavy heart, feeling unsteady, but resolved to keep going. Yet the whispers followed me all day. Sitting at my desk, I tried to focus on a client's file, but the words in my head were relentless. "You're failing them. You're not a good mother. You can't do it all." I'm not sure if it was stress, anxiety, or something else that conjured these whispery echoes of Margaret's criticisms, but it was paralyzing. By the time I headed home, Manhattan's neon glow lighting my path, I felt raw and drained, like I could burst into tears at the slightest provocation. That night was worse. I remember lying awake again, glancing at the red numbers on the alarm clock. 2:37 a.m., just as the night before, and feeling a sense of dread coil in my stomach. James was asleep, or at least pretending to be. Sometimes I wondered if he was just as anxious as I was. Did he hear my ragged breathing in the dark? Did he sense the tension in my body as I lay stiffly beside him? The voice returned unbidden. "They'd be better off without you." And this time I believed it, even if for just a few moments. Guilt washed over me. Guilt for thinking such a thing. Guilt for the sense of relief I felt at the idea of escaping. I recalled times in high school when everything felt too heavy, and I had turned to coping methods that left me scarred, literally. My wrist twinged with the memory of the small cut I once inflicted on myself. I inhaled, trying to slow the racing thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I slept in fits and starts until morning. The next day, everything collapsed in on me. I was at work, in the cramped little office bathroom, holding a pregnancy test in my trembling hand. After a month of missed periods, I thought maybe, just maybe, I was pregnant again. And the truth is, I didn't know if that possibility left me hopeful or horrified. Having another child felt like an avalanche of responsibility. But part of me longed for that new beginning, a fresh sense of purpose. The test was negative. I felt both relief and a strange wave of disappointment that made me nauseous. I had so many conflicting emotions swirling in my chest, and I couldn't unravel them fast enough. I threw the test away, washed my hands, and stared at my pale reflection in the mirror. My eyes were lined with dark circles, my hair limp from stress. A wave of dizziness hit me. For a second, I thought I might pass out right there. I splashed cold water on my face, took several deep breaths, and forced myself to head back to my desk. Work was a blur. Emails, phone calls, deadlines. By the time I left the building that evening, I was in a daze. longing for nothing more than to curl up in bed. But the moment I walked into the apartment, I found Margaret waiting for me in the hallway. Her eyes narrowed, a stack of papers in her hand. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice tight with anger. She shoved the papers at me. Sophie's math test. A glaring 62% stared up at me, circled in bright red ink. Parent-teacher conference was this afternoon, Margaret hissed. "You forgot." Again. I felt my pulse spike. My cheeks heated in shame. I had indeed forgotten, and the guilt settled on me like a crushing weight. "I had a last-minute client call," I stammered lamely. "I couldn't..." Margaret's voice cracked across mine. "Your clients are more important than your daughter." It was like a switch flipped inside me. My heart thundered. All the nights of hearing her voice in my head, the silent judgments, the constant feeling of inadequacy, they all erupted. "Get out," I said, my voice sounding distant, even to my own ears. She blinked, taken aback. "What?" "Get. Outside. Office. My house." My hands trembled at my sides. I could hardly believe what I was saying, or the fury that pulsed through my veins. Her face went pale, then cold. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice a hiss. I said nothing. My mind was too full of static, too consumed by the raw pain of everything that had built up to this moment. When she finally retreated to her bedroom, slamming the door shut, I sank onto the sofa, burying my face in my hands. My chest felt tight, tears flooding my eyes. I had never spoken to her like that before. Yet, the immediate relief was mixed with a fresh surge of guilt. I could only sit there, trembling, wondering what on earth I was going to do now. James came home late from the office. I heard him and Margaret arguing quietly in the hallway. Her sharp whisper, his subdued tones. Then he came into the living room, looking spent. He paused, seeing me curled up on the couch, arms wrapped around my knees. I waited for him to speak, but he just sighed and walked into the bedroom. When I finally followed him, he was already under the covers, turned away from me. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about anything, and I had never felt so alone. That night, the whispers were deafening. I felt as though I couldn't breathe, like my chest was pinned beneath a crushing weight. Something in me decided I needed to run, leave the apartment, leave that tension behind, even if just for a moment. I threw on a coat over my pajamas, grabbed my keys, and slipped out the door. Driving through the Manhattan streets in the middle of the night is surreal. The rain had started, and the wet pavement reflected the streetlights in blurred, shifting patterns. I turned on the radio to distract myself, but every station seemed too bright, too loud, or too sad. Finally, I turned it off. There was only the thud of my heart, the swish of the windshield wipers, and the distant hum of traffic. Somehow I ended up outside Trinity Church, that iconic spire piercing the storm clouds. I parked on the street, rain splattering the windshield. I remembered from a friend that the sanctuary often stayed open late for prayer, though I couldn't recall the exact hours. On a whim, or perhaps guided by some invisible thread of hope, I stepped into the drizzle, crossing the sidewalk to push open the large, heavy doors. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of incense and melted candle wax. Dim lights illuminated the aisles, and I walked past rows of pews until I spotted a single figure kneeling near the front. Kathy. I recognized her from a local women's group I had attended sporadically at the church. She wasn't just some random acquaintance. We had spoken a few times in passing, exchanging pleasantries about motherhood and faith. She turned her head as I approached, her expression soft and welcoming. "Anna?" she said, and her voice was a quiet anchor in the stillness. Couldn't sleep. I sank onto the pew beside her, my eyes already stinging with tears. "I almost left them," I whispered, the confession ripping through me. "Tonight I packed a suitcase. I wanted to disappear." Kathy rested a hand on my shoulder. "The load is heavy, isn't it?" I nodded, unable to speak. Finally, my words came out in a torrent. I told her about the swirling voices in my head, the constant condemnation, the feeling that I was failing as a mother, as a wife. I told her about Margaret's criticisms, about James's distance, about the negative pregnancy test that left me feeling unmoored. She listened quietly, her presence radiating calm. "Sometimes," she said, "God's voice is hidden behind our deepest shame. We can't hear him through the noise of our own guilt, but he's there." Then she handed me a worn Bible, open to Psalm 23. "Read it," she urged softly. I held the thin pages gingerly. My voice trembled as I began. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." I paused, swallowing back tears at the familiar passage. Images of my childhood Sunday school classes flashed through my mind, the sense of comfort those words once brought me. Then Kathy said something that took me by surprise. "Now, replace he with I." I blinked. "I don't understand," I murmured. She smiled gently. "Try it. It's not to ignore God, but to acknowledge that the shepherd is already within you. Sometimes we wait for permission to lie down in green pastures, to find rest. But the truth is, we have to claim it for ourselves." Slowly, haltingly, I read again. "I make myself lie down in green pastures. I restore my soul." As I spoke those words, something within me shifted. It wasn't an immediate peace, but rather the faintest glimmer of autonomy. I realized I'd been waiting for someone, maybe God, maybe James, maybe even Margaret, to rescue me. But the shepherd, the divine guide, was already here, waiting for me to accept rest, to accept restoration. I just had to let go of the illusions and choose it. Kathy closed the Bible softly and looked me in the eyes. "We say, he leads me beside still waters, but those waters are right there. You have to step in. You have to be willing to be led." I clung to her words as if they were a lifeline. We prayed together, though my prayer was little more than a choked sob that rose from the pit of my stomach. Eventually, I left the church. The rain, now only a drizzle. When I got back into the car, I felt physically exhausted, but somehow emotionally lighter. When I arrived home, I found James in the living room, slumped on the couch, the TV flickering. At first, I wondered if he'd fallen asleep there, but as I set down my keys, he stirred, rubbing his eyes. "You left in the middle of the night," he said quietly, accusation in his voice. I was worried. I hesitated. Something in me wanted to snap back. "Were you really worried? Or are you just resentful?" But I bit my tongue. Instead, I lowered myself onto the couch beside him, leaving a few inches between us. "We need to talk," I said, and my voice trembled with the weight of it. "About your mother, about us," he sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "Mum's trying to help," he began, his tone both defensive and uncertain. "No," I replied, finding a steadiness in my voice that surprised even me. "She's drowning me, and you're letting her." That sparked a real argument. The first raw, honest argument we'd had in years. We didn't tiptoe around each other this time. We shouted. I told him about how I felt judged, how I felt alone, how the affair rumors that had circulated briefly at his office had left me feeling vulnerable and suspicious. Like maybe he was distancing himself for a reason. He fired back that he was under immense pressure at work, that Margaret was the only one who seemed to help with the kids when I was too busy. At some point, I heard something shatter in the kitchen. One of us must have slammed a cabinet door too hard, or maybe I knocked over a dish in my frustration. By the time the sky began to brighten with the first light of dawn, we were both exhausted, red-eyed, and spent. There were no neat resolutions, no neat bows tied around our problems, but there was a rawness in our confessions that felt oddly relieving. We had opened the wound, and maybe, just maybe, it could finally begin to heal. Before we collapsed into bed, James reached for my hand. "I'm scared too," he whispered. His voice cracked on the words, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. It undid me. In that moment, I realized we were both just terrified, clinging to illusions of control and normalcy. I pressed my forehead to his. "We'll figure it out," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure how. The next couple of days were tense. Margaret stayed mostly in her room, emerging occasionally to fuss over the children or make herself tea. She and I didn't speak more than a few necessary words. James kept his distance, throwing himself into work, perhaps to avoid the strain at home. Meanwhile, the whispers in my head didn't vanish, but they dimmed slightly, like a radio station that was losing signal. I kept reminding myself of Kathy's counsel, reminding myself that I had the choice to seek green pastures, even if it was just in brief moments each day. I started waking up a little earlier to write in a journal, pouring out my anxieties on the page instead of letting them fester. Sometimes I read Psalm 23 again, quietly, letting the words settle over me like a gentle blanket. It wasn't easy. The kids sensed the tension. Sophie began to retreat into her room, losing herself in a stack of library books. Liam, sweet boy that he is, started asking if Grandma was mad. If I'd had the emotional energy, I might have tried to spin a comforting lie. But instead I just told him Grandma needed some quiet time. He looked at me with wide eyes and shrugged, accepting my vague explanation. Children are remarkably resilient, but I worried about the long-term effects of all this stress. I knew I had to confront Margaret again, but this time from a place of calm rather than anger. My chance came on a Saturday morning. James had taken Liam to soccer practice, and Sophie was at a friend's birthday party. Margaret was in the living room, folding laundry with a rigid precision. I watched her for a moment, noticing the lines etched across her forehead, the frown she wore as her permanent expression. She was once a wife, a mother, a woman with her own dreams and fears. It occurred to me that maybe she wasn't just a villain in my story, but a person shaped by her own scars. She glanced up at me. "Yes?" she said, voice clipped. I drew in a breath. "I'd like to invite you to brunch. Just the two of us. There's a little diner nearby. I thought we could talk." She looked at me suspiciously. "Talk about what?" "About us. The way things are." I offered a small smile, trying to convey sincerity. She hesitated, then finally set down the laundry and nodded. We walked the few blocks to the diner in near silence. My heart drummed in my chest. I kept reciting bits of Psalm 23 in my mind, like a mantra. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." I tried not to think of Margaret as my enemy, though a part of me still felt that sting. The diner was bustling, filled with the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. We found a booth by the window, the plastic seat squeaking as we settled in. Margaret looked around with a faint air of disapproval, as if the place was beneath her, but she didn't say anything. When the waitress brought menus and poured us coffee, we spent a few awkward minutes debating whether to order pancakes or omelets. Eventually, I pushed my menu aside and cleared my throat. "Margaret," I began carefully, "I just want to say, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled at you. I know you think I'm not doing right by Sophie and Liam. And maybe you're right that I've been distracted. But I also feel like there's more to this. More to why you disapprove." She stirred her coffee, gaze lowered. "I don't disapprove," she said in a tight voice. But I could tell she didn't believe her own words. She exhaled sharply. "It's just, I've seen what happens when a mother is too busy for her kids." My pulse quickened. "You're referring to James's father, aren't you?" I asked gently. She looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "He left because I was too much," she said, her tone bitter. "He said I nagged too often, that I overcompensated with James because I was overshadowing him somehow, and so he walked away from us." Her fingers trembled around the coffee mug. "I don't want James to leave you like that. I keep seeing the same patterns. The missed dinners, the missed school events, the tension. And I worry. So I push." Emotion swelled in my throat. I reached across the table, resting my hand on hers. "I understand your fear," I murmured. "But James isn't going to leave because of me. If anything, he and I need to work together, talk about our struggles so they don't drive us apart. I appreciate that you're concerned for him and for our kids. But pushing me with criticism isn't helping. It just makes me feel like I'm drowning." She said nothing for a long moment, her eyes downcast. Finally, she nodded, tears beginning to slip from her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, almost inaudibly. I was so afraid of history repeating itself that I became unbearable. Her vulnerability touched me deeply. In that moment, any anger I felt toward her began to melt away. I squeezed her hand. "We can figure this out together," I said. "But I need you to trust me with my kids, to believe that I love them. If I'm messing up sometimes, I'll own that. Just help me. Don't tear me down." She swallowed, nodding again. Then, as if embarrassed by her tears, she pulled her hand away and dabbed her eyes with a napkin. "All right," she said, clearing her throat. She looked up at me, and for the first time since moving in, her gaze was gentle. "All right." We ordered breakfast. Pancakes with strawberries for me, scrambled eggs and toast for her, and spent the rest of the meal in cautious conversation. It wasn't exactly warm and fussy, but it was a start. I told her about how work had become overwhelming, about the anxiety I was experiencing at night, about the negative pregnancy test that had thrown me for a loop. She admitted she felt guilty for not helping more with Sophie's studies, and that she worried about losing her place in our family if she wasn't constantly inserting herself. When we finally left the diner, we stepped onto the sidewalk, the sun streaming down. The city felt alive and welcoming in that moment, as though the streets themselves were congratulating us for forging a truce. Over the next few weeks, a tenuous peace settled into our home. Margaret didn't move out, though that question still hung in the air. Instead, we found a rhythm that was more collaborative. She helped with the children's schedules in a supportive way, and I tried harder to be more attentive to Sophie and Liam's day-to-day needs. We were far from perfect, of course, but the tension that had nearly suffocated us began to ease. James and I had more conversations, sometimes painful, sometimes cathartic. We discussed the rumors about the affair, which stemmed from an innocuous late-night phone call James had made to a female colleague months ago, fueling gossip at his office. He assured me there was no truth to it, but admitted he had become cold and distant because the rumors embarrassed him. He felt caught between wanting to defend me against the gossip and not wanting to draw more attention to the situation. I told him how it made me feel worthless, how it fed those voices in my head. We cried together, acknowledging how easily we had let this wedge form between us. Kathy's advice continued to resonate with me. Sometimes, when the whispers in my head threatened to overwhelm me, I'd silently recite, "I restore my soul. I lead myself beside still waters." It was a small exercise, but it reminded me that I had a choice in how I responded to my own negative thoughts. Sophie's math struggles persisted. but with Margaret's help and mine. Once I reorganized my schedule to be more present, Sophie began to improve. Liam still occasionally asked if Grandma was mad, but over time he noticed Margaret's warmer demeanor. She started baking cookies with them on weekends, reading bedtime stories, showing them old photo albums of James as a child. The kids seemed to blossom under the calmer household atmosphere. One Sunday after church, James and I decided to take the children to Central Park. It was early spring, the kind of day when the sun is bright, but still has a gentle warmth to it, and the grass is dotted with tiny blossoms. Margaret stayed behind, choosing to enjoy some quiet time at home, which was fine by me. I felt like we all needed moments of separate space. Central Park was alive with families, joggers, street performers, and tourists snapping photos. We spread out a blanket on the great lawn, and I watched Sophie and Liam chase butterflies that danced just out of reach. The two of them were giggling in that carefree way that children do, and it struck me how rarely I'd paused to enjoy such simple beauty lately. James lay down on the blanket, placing his head in my lap. His eyes fluttered shut, exhaustion evident in the lines on his face. I softly combed my fingers through his hair, my heart swelling with affection for him, for our family. I realized how close I had come to walking away. A part of me had believed that maybe my leaving would make their lives better, that my presence was a burden. But in that moment, James's hand loosely clasping mine, the kids squealing with joy as they ran around, I saw the lie in that belief. I was needed. I was loved. And no matter how loud those whispers became, I could answer them with a gentle but firm declaration. I am enough. A breeze swept across the lawn, carrying the laughter of strangers and the distant strum of a street musician's guitar. For a moment, I closed my eyes, inhaling the scent of fresh grass and the city. I found myself murmuring Psalm 23 again, but this time I let the words roll over me like a blessing, reminding me that I was never truly alone. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, I whispered, feeling the truth of it sink into my soul. In my mind, I pictured Kathy smiling, her gentle encouragement echoing. The shepherd doesn't force you into green pastures. You choose to stop running. Yes, I thought. I choose to rest. I choose to trust that restoration is possible. Somewhere between that realization and the warmth of the sun on my face, I found a peace that had eluded me for weeks. The shadows of doubt hadn't vanished. They still lurked in the corners of my mind, ready to pounce whenever I felt insecure or overwhelmed. But at least now I had a response ready. Whenever they whispered, "You're not good enough," I answered aloud, quietly but firmly, "I am enough." And in the hush of that internal battle, I felt a presence beside me, a divine assurance that I was walking this path with guidance, that every stumbling step could lead to deeper faith and stronger love if only I allowed it. James stirred in my lap. "You okay?" he murmured, blinking up at me. I smiled down at him. "Yeah," I said, voice steady. "For the first time in a while, I think I am." He sat up, pulling me into a gentle hug, pressing his cheek against my shoulder. "I love you," he said, and it felt raw and genuine, like a salve over old wounds. We stayed like that for a while, letting the kids play in the grass, letting time stretch lazily in the afternoon sun. Eventually, Sophie ran up to us, breathless from chasing her brother, and flopped onto the blanket. "Mom," she panted. "I caught a butterfly for a second, but it flew away." Liam, trailing behind, added, "It landed on Sophie's hand, but then it went whoosh." I gathered both of them close, relishing their giggles and sweaty little faces. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it. In that moment, everything felt wonderful. The breezy day, the color in my children's cheeks, the fact that together we were finding our way. I pressed my forehead to Sophie's, and she grinned up at me. "You seem happy, Mom," she said, her eyes brimming with curiosity. "Are you not tired anymore?" I laughed softly. "I'm still a little tired," I admitted, "but I'm a lot happier." And it was true. James lay back down, eyes drifting shut again. Sophie and Liam started wrestling playfully over a plush butterfly toy that came from who knows where. I took a moment to watch them, my family, and felt tears prick the back of my eyes. Not from sorrow, but from gratitude. And as the sun began its slow descent toward the skyscrapers on the horizon, I took a deep breath, repeating those powerful words in my head. I am enough. To my surprise, over the subsequent weeks, Margaret began to show a gentler side. She still had her moments. Old habits die hard. But she was more mindful of her tone and her tendency to micromanage my household. Once, I even caught her complimenting Sophie's improvised dinner, mac and cheese with a random scattering of chopped veggies, without a single word of complaint about nutrition. James and I found a counselor, a suggestion from Kathy and another friend from church. We started attending weekly sessions where we worked through our communication breakdowns, our resentments, our fears. It was painful to dig into the raw spots, but cathartic. We even touched on James's childhood, his father's abandonment, and how that shaped James's need to keep the peace at all costs, even if it meant avoiding confrontation with his mother and ignoring the tension with me. Meanwhile, I dove back into my work with a slightly altered perspective. Instead of throwing myself at every late-night email, I set boundaries. I started leaving the office at a more reasonable hour, dedicating time each evening to go over homework with Sophie and read to Liam. When my boss questioned my new schedule, I explained calmly but firmly that I needed a better work-life balance. I'd still get my work done, but on a timeline that respected my family life. It was nerve-wracking to assert myself like that. But ultimately, my boss was understanding. He had a family too, after all. Things weren't perfect. Every now and then, the old insecurities crept up on me. If Sophie came home with a poor grade, or if Liam threw a tantrum, I'd hear Margaret's criticisms echoing in my head, or even my own self-doubts, telling me I wasn't a competent mother. But each time, I remembered Psalm 23, remembered the lesson Kathy gave me about substituting he with I. I pictured myself lying down in green pastures of my own volition, letting myself find rest, trusting that I could lead myself beside still waters. And as a person of faith, that didn't mean I no longer believed in God's guidance. Quite the opposite. It meant I recognized God had already endowed me with strength and love and courage. I just had to embrace it. One evening, as I tucked Liam into bed, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Mommy, are you happy I'm here?" My heart constricted. "Of course, sweetie," I said, smoothing his hair. "I love you very much." He blinked up at me with serious eyes. "But sometimes you look sad, like you have big thoughts. I just want to make sure you're happy." I smiled, tears threatening. "Oh, Liam, you make me happy every day. Even when Mommy's sad, it's not because of you. Sometimes adults have worries, like grown-up problems. But you and Sophie, you both bring me more joy than you can imagine." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing my words, then rolled onto his side. I kissed his forehead, my heart aching with love. That was the moment I realized how attuned children are to our emotions, how they sense even the things we think we've hidden so well. It renewed my commitment to creating a peaceful environment, not just for myself, but for them. They deserved a mother who wasn't constantly on the edge of a breakdown, and I deserved to not be on that edge. After tucking in Sophie as well, she was finishing up a chapter in a book and insisted on reading for a few more minutes. I found James in the living room, flipping through channels. I curled up beside him on the couch, resting my head on his shoulder. He turned off the TV and wrapped an arm around me. We sat in a companionable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the city through our windows, the muted traffic, a distant horn, the faint hum of life outside. Eventually he spoke. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice gentle. I tilted my head to look up at him. "Why?" "You stood up for yourself. You found a way to handle work and the kids without sacrificing your sanity. And you're letting me in again." He paused, swallowing. "I'm sorry for all the times I shut you out." Tears prickled at my eyes. I laid a hand on his chest. "I'm sorry too," I whispered. "For shutting myself out, really. I forgot that I'm allowed to have needs. That I'm allowed to say no, that I can't do everything perfectly." He pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. "We'll keep figuring it out," he said. And I believed him. A few days later, Margaret came to me in the early evening, just before dinner time. I was preparing spaghetti in the kitchen, actual fresh ingredients, which felt like a small victory. She hesitated in the doorway for a moment, clutching a small piece of paper. "Anna," she said, I wanted to show you something." She extended the paper towards me. It was a faded photograph of James as a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, wearing a baseball cap and a grin that lit up his whole face. Next to him stood Margaret, younger and smiling, her eyes full of life. And next to them both was a man I assumed to be James's father, tall, with an arm draped around them. I blinked, studying the photo. "You look happy," I said gently. She nodded, lips pressed tight. We were, for a time, before things changed. I set down the spoon I'd been using to stir the sauce, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Thank you for sharing this," I told her. Her gaze flicked to the floor. "I just wanted to say that I don't want to lose this family too. Not after everything." I felt my throat tighten. Carefully, I approached her, placing a hand on her arm. "You won't lose us," I whispered. "We're not going anywhere, but we all have to work on this together, okay?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. In that moment, I saw the ghost of her past. A woman still grieving the life she once had, terrified of reliving the same pain. Compassion flooded through me. We stayed like that for a few moments, the smell of tomato sauce filling the kitchen, the hum of the overhead light flickering. It felt like a silent pact was formed, a bridge built between us. Sophie and Liam bounded in, demanding dinner. Margaret and I broke apart, each of us smiling at them. I returned the photograph to Margaret, and she slipped it carefully into her cardigan pocket. The kids prattled on about their day. Sophie had scored well on a pop quiz, and Liam had learned a new soccer move. I felt Margaret's gaze on me from time to time as we busied ourselves with setting the table. But it was no longer the harsh, judgmental stare. It was something softer, tinted with respect, maybe even gratitude. As the weeks rolled on, life still had its ups and downs. There were days when deadlines at work piled up, or the kids squabbled non-stop. There were evenings when Margaret and I disagreed on small things, like whether Liam should be allowed dessert if he hadn't eaten all his vegetables. But the difference was the undercurrent of respect. We started communicating instead of letting resentments fester. I continued to see Kathy at church, too. Sometimes we'd meet for coffee, and she'd ask how I was doing. I told her about the subtle but meaningful changes in my life. The way James and I had learned to talk about our fears before they festered. The way Margaret had softened around the edges. The way I'd found some measure of silence for those negative voices in my head. "I don't think they'll ever disappear," I confided to Kathy once, sipping my latte. "The whispers, sometimes they're still there, telling me I'm not enough." She nodded. "They might not vanish, but you don't have to let them rule you," she said. "Remember, the shepherd walks beside you to show you that you can stand. You don't need him to carry you all the time." Her words resonated. I thought about them often. The idea that God wasn't necessarily there to lift me out of every trouble, but to prove that within me was the capacity to persevere. It was a subtle shift in perspective, but a powerful one. One late afternoon, I found myself back in Central Park, this time alone. I'd left the office a bit early to carve out some solitude. Margaret was with the kids, and James was working late, so I took the chance to stroll through the park, letting the bustle of the city fade into the background. I ended up near the Great Lawn again, watching a pickup softball game from a distance. The players shouted encouragement to one another, the crack of the bat echoing in the spring air. I sat on a bench, letting the mild breeze tousle my hair. A young couple walked by, holding hands. An elderly man hobbled past with a cane, nodding politely in my direction. The sky was a serene blue, dotted with fluffy clouds. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at ease. My mind drifted to that line in Psalm 23. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. I'd always read that verse as a promise of protection from outside threats. But in recent weeks, I'd come to realize that sometimes our enemies are internal. Our pride, our fear, our sense of unworthiness. The table is prepared in the midst of those shadows, inviting us to feast on hope, on love, on redemption. And there, in that quiet moment, I felt like I'd finally pulled up a chair at that table. I closed my eyes and let a prayer rise from my heart. One of gratitude, one of resolve. When I stood up again, I felt steadier than I had in years. Looking back now, I see how close I was to letting the darkness consume me. The whispers had become such a deafening chorus of negativity that I couldn't see a path forward. But here I am, standing, breathing, finding joy in the small moments, rebuilding my relationships one day at a time. If I could go back to that night at 2:37 a.m. when I first heard those whispers telling me I was failing, I'd tell myself, keep going, Anna. You are enough. You've always been enough. And maybe that's what faith is. A willingness to believe in the presence of love and worthiness despite the shadows. To trust that every valley, no matter how dark, holds lessons for us. To recognize that the shepherd's rod and staff are there to guide, but also to remind us that our own 2 feet can walk through the valley and come out on the other side. Some nights, the old anxieties still creep in, especially on evenings when I work too late or when the kids have a meltdown. I might lie awake, the clock blinking in red numerals, and feel that old dread stirring. But now I know what to do. I breathe, I pray, and I tell myself that I can choose rest. I can choose to believe in my capacity to nurture my family and myself. And more often than not, that simple shift in perspective is enough to quiet the storm inside me. I suppose my story is still unfolding. Margaret's redemption arc isn't complete. James and I still have layers of communication to unearth. And Sophie's academic struggles will likely keep ebbing and flowing. But we're in it together. And for once, I'm not running from that fact. I'm learning to embrace it, to embrace them, to embrace myself. So if you ever find yourself facing those whispers of self-doubt, of fear, of inadequacy, I hope you remember a tiny corner of my journey. I hope you remember that sometimes the very thing we think is crushing us is the invitation to explore our own resilience. Sometimes the valley of the shadow is where we discover how strong we truly are and how deeply we are loved. For me, it all comes back to that ancient promise echoing through millennia. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Because in learning to lie down in green pastures, to let my soul be restored, I finally understand that the shepherd's presence isn't about removing every struggle from my life. It's about walking with me in the midst of them, reminding me every step of the way that I am indeed enough. And when the shadows lengthen and the night seems darkest, I remember, the shepherd has been walking beside me all along. Not to carry me, but to prove I could stand. I can almost hear Kathy's gentle voice telling me, "Anna, you choose to stop running." And I have. Every day I choose again. And every day I find new mercies, new hope, new strength waiting for me in still waters and green pastures that I never realized I could claim for myself.